Welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. Join us as we explore self-doubt, imposter characters, and even real-life con artists.
Today, we have the pleasure of featuring Wanda M. Morris, acclaimed author of All Her Little Secrets, Anywhere You Run, and What You Leave Behind. Wanda's debut novel, All Her Little Secrets, was praised by Karen Slaughter as brilliantly nuanced, recognized by the New York Times and LA Times and many others, and won the 2022 Lefty Award for Best Debut Mystery Novel. It has been optioned for a limited series starring three-time Emmy winner Uzo Aduba, with Wanda serving as an executive producer. Her sophomore novel, Anywhere You Run, was named a top 10 crime fiction book of 2022 by the New York Times. It received starred reviews from Kirkus and PW and won multiple awards, including the 2023 Lefty Award for Best Historical Novel. And Wanda's latest release, What You Leave Behind, continues to captivate readers and critics alike. It has been named one of the best books of the year so far in 2024 by Amazon editors and featured in People Magazine, Us Weekly, and Women's World Magazine. Booklist awarded it a starred review, praising Wanda's mastery of multiple literary forms. Wanda is a former corporate lawyer and a proud member of Crime Writers of Color, and she serves on the board of International Thriller Writers, lives in Atlanta, Georgia, and is a mother of three.
Liz, I'll take the baton so you can have a moment to catch your breath after that very long list of superlatives. Wanda, thank you for joining us. We are thrilled to have you.
Welcome.
So much, you guys.
That was the version.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Yeah.
Well, Greg, I have so many questions, but let me catch my breath.
Yeah. What I wanted to actually start out with, Wanda, if I could ask you about this, I had the pleasure of catching you at a Thriller Fest panel, I think 2 years ago, during which you regaled the crowd with a very funny story about the kind of extent to which you kept the writing of your debut novel under wraps. And I thought that might be a nice way to jump into our kind of imposter conversation here.
See, Greg, I had not planned on discussing my own imposter status, but yeah, let's get into it. You know what? Here's the thing. First things first, I started writing, because I felt like I had to. I felt like I had all this stuff that was inside of me, and it was like cathartic almost to just write. Now, I'd never written a book before. I'd never, I tried my hand at some creative nonfiction once, and I think I even entered a contest, and it didn't go well. Anyway, we don't need to get into that. So when I decided, okay, yeah, I'm really going to sit down and I'm going to write this book, I did not feel confident. Like, yeah, of course I'm writing a book. It's me. I'm Wanda, and I'm, fantastically creative. I didn't feel all of those things. I felt like, girl, what are you doing? You already have a job. You're trying to raise three kids. You're trying to be a good wife, mother, friend, whatever. So now you're going to add writing a book to, this very long list. So I kept it in secret. I did not even tell my husband I was writing a book. And so, I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd write for about an hour, and then I would get my kids up at 6 to get them off to school. I wrote on airplanes. I wrote if I was sitting in the car waiting on my kids to get out of their practices. And then every day I would go over to the library that was right around the corner from my job, and I would sit in there and write for an hour and a half on my lunch break. And it was so funny because people would ask me, "You always eat lunch at your desk?" And I'm like, busy, busy, busy.
Right.
But, I just didn't feel like, this was something that I could actually do. I just always thought writing a book was for people who were wildly more creative and talented than I was. The jig was up though when I applied to a workshop, and wonders of wonders, I got in, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to have to be away for 2 weeks. So it was like, yeah, honey, I'm going to have to be away and you're going to have to, take care of the kids. And he's like, where are you going for 2 weeks? It's like, you know, to entertain men. What do you think? So I had to finally tell so, so I had to finally tell him, I entered this, this contest and I got into this workshop and it's for 2 weeks. And I
Mhm.
was like, I wrote a book. And he's like, you wrote a book? And I was like, yeah, I wrote a book. So yeah, here's the thing. No lie, I did not tell extended family and friends that I'd written a book until the link went live on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and then I had to post, and then people were like, "You wrote a book? Oh my god!" So yeah, I guess, gosh, yeah, Greg, I guess I was an imposter, huh? I never
I
thought
mean,
of it that way.
I think we all are. I mean, I still can't believe to this day that I get to write books for people to read that are published. I mean, I don't, yeah,
Right? I
Yeah.
I
every
still
day,
that still blows my mind. That
every day.
still blows my mind. Every time I pick up a book of mine and I'm like, "Oh my god, there's a lady in Paducah, Kentucky reading this book right now." Like, what
Yeah,
the
it's unreal.
heck?
And Wanda, you didn't just write one book, you've written three, and it sounds like you're working on another, which we may ask you about later. But, this just shows, I think a lot of people talk about that everyone has a book in them. And I've certainly encountered people out in life who say, oh, yeah, I could write a book, or my life is really interesting. But as we all know, to sit down and actually complete a book is a pretty big feat. And to do more than one, I mean, so you are clearly a writer. And what is so remarkable about your story is that you didn't tell anyone, as you said. And it's such an isolating, exercise anyway, and one that can be really filled with like self-doubt if you're writing in a vacuum. So what was it like to go to a workshop and have other people see your writing for the first time?
Oh my gosh, that was wow, that was an experience. It was really, really good because I learned so much. Like, excuse me, the other workshop participants were, so wonderful. And their criticism, I wouldn't even call it criticism, their critique was so valuable to me. But it was also very frightening, right? Because to your point, it's very isolating to write. Now, nobody knew that I was writing at all. And so to now, at this particular workshop, you had to, read aloud, a
Mm.
section of your manuscript. And at the time, I was working on All Her Little Secrets, which was my debut book. And it was really, really scary. But funny story, I read the opening scene from that book, and it's not a
Mm.
spoiler. With the opening scene, she Elise Littlejohn, the protagonist, she walks into the executive suite and she finds her boss dead with a gunshot in his head. And it's, I don't know whether foolishly or not, I picked that particular section to read on the first day of the workshop. And so I was very nervous and I had my head down and I'm just reading and I'm not looking. And when I finished, I looked up and everybody else around the table was like, it's like, oh no, what have I done? And one lady even commented, she was so funny. She was like, I talked to you, we had breakfast, and you're such a nice lady. And that was just, I was like,
You didn't know
oh
you had
boy.
it in you. well,
I
well
thought
that,
I had like screwed up big time, but she was like, I've come to grips now, by book 4, which I'm working on, I now have come to grips with the fact that I can go pretty dark.
mhm.
But that first time reading out loud in front of a group of people, it was just, overwhelming, in both good and, not so good ways. Yeah.
I'm sure. Well, and to write thrillers specifically, at least your first book,
Mhm.
and I've read that opening. I mean, you read it, and then it's like, okay, I'm sitting down, and this is what I'm doing today. It's so gripping and visceral. Did you, when you set out, did you have the idea for the story in your first book, or did you just kind of say in a general way, I want to write a thriller? Like, tell me and us a little bit about that, how you decided to go into this genre.
You know what? It's interesting. I've always loved thrillers. So, I read all different genres, but thrillers somehow are always kind of my jam. And I think it's because I used to travel a lot, as a practicing attorney. And so I was always in and out of airports. And so that's where I got a lot of my books. I would just, go get a book and I could read a thriller. I was traveling back and forth to California. So I was able to read a thriller in the time it took me to fly out to California and fly back home. It's like 10 hours. And so I could usually finish a book on a trip. And so when I finally decided, yeah, I'm going to write this book, it wasn't so much that I thought, yeah, I'm going to write a thriller. I had this character in mind, and I always tend to start off with characters. Um, but I always had this woman in mind, and I guess because I was a lawyer, I always wondered what would happen if um, your moral obligation, as a sister, as a family member, conflicted with your ethical obligations as a
Mm,
lawyer. And what would you do if you had to make a decision between one or the other? Which is essentially kind of the underlying theme of what happens with Elise Littlejohn in this book. And
mhm,
so I would be sitting in meetings at work and thinking about Elise Littlejohn and Sam Littlejohn and thinking, ooh, what would happen if? Um, and so, I think because I always gravitated towards reading thrillers, it kind of became kind of a natural outgrowth. But I didn't really set out to say, yeah, I'm gonna write a thriller. But
yeah.
I love the genre. I really do. And, the other thing, if we're going to be honest here, is I didn't find a lot of thrillers out there that had female protagonists that look like me, right? I
Mhm,
love, 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 all the thriller authors that are out there, but I never found a lot of books that centered a smart Black female who wasn't like a detective or a cop or something like that, but just, everyday woman trying to kind of live her life. And I thought, maybe there's something here.
mm. I love that.
I
Yeah, one of the things that, go ahead,
sorry, I'm not sure
Greg,
quite
did you
where
want
I
to go?
missed. Sure, yeah, I cut out for a moment, so forgive me if I'm treading over anything that's been covered in the last few minutes. But I wanted to ask a question. You brought up the fact that your first book is a thriller, but also one of the things I really admire about your writing, Wanda, is how you seem to kind of expand your craft a little bit with each book in a different way. I mean, the first book, I think you guys just talked about a bit. With the second book, you're working in an historical fiction mode, which right off the bat, that ups the ante in terms of the research, the world building, all of those things. And then in your most recent book, What You Leave Behind, you are touching on spirituality and a bit of the supernatural as well. And what I'm curious about with your writing is, are you, when you're going out with each project, are you intentionally kind of like looking to raise the bar for yourself as an author, or is it more that you have themes that you want to explore and then you end up finding these kind of varying frameworks that best fit those themes?
Mm, that's an excellent question. I think for me, I really am trying to push the envelope a little.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm,
and I think the reason why is because for so long I tamped down my desire to do this, right? I was, you know, working all those years as a lawyer and dreaming about writing books. And so I always wanted to, um, you know, do something in a book that, like I would like to read. So I thought to myself, it would be great to, see somebody who looks like me in a book. Um, but I think it is also a little bit of what you said about, kind of themes resonating. I had, after I finished All Her Little Secrets, my editor was like, okay, what are you going to write next?
Mhm.
And, of course, people are like, oh, you got to write All Her Little Secrets part two. I want to know what happens to Elise.
Right. Right.
And I was like, yeah, okay, I'll write All Her Little Secrets part two. But what happened is that we had just gone through the 2020 election, and there was all
Right.
this noise and rancor about the big lie.
Mhm.
And I live in the state of Georgia, lots and lots and lots of discussion about voter suppression.
Sure.
And I thought to myself, how is it that we are, 60 years removed from the Voting Rights Act?
Mhm.
Of 1964, and we're still grappling with these things. How is it that we're still grappling with, racism and sexism and women's right to govern her own body and gay and lesbian rights? It's like, why are we still repeating this cycle? And
Right.
I thought, oh, it might be cool to explore that in my next book, but I couldn't really find a contemporary angle. And I
Yeah.
thought maybe it might even be better to just draw the parallels between what was going on 60 years ago and how closely it resembles 2024, or at the time 2022 when that book came out. Um, and so I think it's a little bit of both that, I do want to tackle themes. I do want to tackle those things that make me, mad and sad and, angry.
Yeah.
But I also want to make sure too that it's an engaging and entertaining read. And for me, that means I need to push the envelope a little bit as well. I
Mhm.
don't want to just kind of rinse and repeat and do the same
Right.
kind of thing over and over again.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things, I was thinking when you were answering the previous question about, writing a character that you had not seen, generally speaking, in other thrillers, I think you've done that really beautifully. And also, I think a lot of thrillers keep things kind of light as far as issues being addressed. It's kind of more about the inciting incident and the characters, which is great. And there's a lot of fantastic books, kind of written around that structure. But what you've done in all of your books, as you mentioned, is really tackle these like racial and social inequalities, women's reproductive rights. You have incredibly strong female characters, often in positions of professional power, but they're still kind of going up against other forms of oppression. And those issues are so tightly woven in with your plot that I think there's a lot of commentary and even education that's happening that I haven't seen in a lot of other thrillers, which is really exciting. And I love that. I mean, I think I've learned things in each one of your books, particularly in your second book. And what you were talking about, the parallels between 1964 and now are staggering,
Mm.
um, but really make for very fertile thriller, you know, topics. This is all really scary shit
Right?
and really
It
real.
it really
Um,
is.
so I realized there wasn't a question necessarily in that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that, I think you've done this so well. And as Greg said, you kind of keep upping the ante. So I guess my question for you is, are you feeling the pressure of your own upping of that ante? Do you struggle
Mm.
do you feel like you have to have an issue in each book now?
You know what? It's so funny. You should really ask my husband this question because he he laughs at me because, like I said, now this book that I'm working on, I'm like, oh, they're gonna think I'm nuts when they read this. They're really gonna somebody's gonna certify me. And he's like, "You said that about the second book. You said that about the third book." I was like, "No, but seriously." But you know what? Again, I think it is that I look out into the world and the things that strike me, like for example, What You Leave Behind, that book came about because I just happened to be watching the news one evening while I was
Mm,
folding laundry and
mm,
learned that this poor woman couldn't get access to FEMA funds because she couldn't prove that the house was hers. And I thought, what an injustice. How does that happen, in this country at this time? And I didn't even practice law in that area. And so I thought, oh, okay, this might be something that if it was new to me, if I found it useful or if I found it an injustice, perhaps other people might do that as well. Um, but it does, by the time I've gotten to the fourth book, I kind of looked around and I was like, oh, okay. So is my brand that I gotta have a big issue? And I don't know. I still am in that kind of, I don't know, that kind of juvenile state where I still feel like, oh, I'll just skip along and write the stuff that I want to write,
Yeah.
and hopefully, publishers will continue to tell me, yeah, keep doing that. But I just try to weave together a story, based on something. Like I said, I've looked out into the world, I've seen something. That first book, All Her Little Secrets, was about a Black female lawyer who worked in corporate America. Well, I didn't really stretch myself there, right? I'm a Black female who worked in corporate America, duh. Um, but again, it was a reflection of the fact that I worked in this kind of microcosm
Mhm.
that didn't value me and what that felt like and what that meant. And I started out writing it kind of like, I don't want to say for me, because everybody writes a book to be read, but I
Mhm.
wrote that book thinking there's not going to be a lot of people that will, find this useful. And I
Mhm.
still get people who walk up to me to this day and they go, "Oh my gosh, that scene where she's, in the boardroom and the guy is wagging his finger at her. That happened to me." And that
mm,
just, it breaks my heart and it touches me at the same time, right? That
Yeah.
my experience was not that unique, but perhaps in writing that, other people found, some strength or some entertainment or whatever they found in that book that resonated with them. Um,
yeah,
so, again, like I said, I just kind of look out into the world and I think, that might be something interesting to tell. I know, especially with the third book, What You Leave Behind, and the whole topic of heirs property, I was like, this is an injustice. Everybody needs to know about this. Everybody, get your
Yeah.
affairs in order. Yeah.
Right.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah. I knew nothing about. Go ahead.
I was going to probably say what you were going to say. I mean, I was familiar with redlining and a lot of dubious real estate practices over the course of like the 20th century in America. I also did not know about heirs property. That was one that was like
Right.
somehow I missed as well, and I would imagine a lot of people probably don't. So to your point, Wanda, I think you do a really great job of sort of the sugar with the medicine in terms of your kind of delivery system where you write these really compelling books with these really like great characters, wonderful plots, but also people are kind of probably without even being that aware of it, they're learning a lot of really important and a lot of, I would say, probably tamped down history in their own country that they probably don't know about, and things that may
Hmm.
affect a lot of your readers directly that they're not aware of. That's got to be a really, that's got to be, I would imagine, pretty gratifying
Yeah.
to be.
Thank you. I'm a lawyer.
Right.
It really is. It really is. I'm a lawyer, and I remember, learning about heirs property my first year in law school. And
Mm,
then nothing beyond that. So I didn't even know, and I'm a lawyer, I didn't even know the impact that it could have on, you know, everyday lives or generational wealth, right? Because we're not talking about just a piece of property. We're talking about something that grows and value over time. And so that means what I leave for my children, then they build on that and they leave it for their children and on and on. And so once again, we have a system that perpetuates the haves versus the have nots.
Mhm.
And to me, certainly, there are probably a few people that would have, no interest in this, but I think for the most part, most people are kind of like, hey, yeah, wait, we're talking about my kids here. We're talking
Yeah.
about, my family here. And I think that those are the kind of stories that resonate with people.
Hmm. Yeah, and along those lines, I mean, I think in all of your books you have elements of family secrecy, and generational trauma. There is, a lot of kind of revelations and reflecting on that, and then grief. Especially, particularly in your third book, can you talk a little bit about, how you use those themes, to move your stories forward? What appeals to you, because I think they're kind of recurring.
Yeah, gosh, you know, I, I I'm sitting here kind of trying to figure out how to answer that question because for me, I think that those themes are just the things that I've seen. Like, I
Mhm.
think everybody has suffered some grief or some loss at some point. Now, everybody may not have had generational trauma, but, you know, I grew up Black and I grew up in a not very wealthy neighborhood. So, yeah, there was some of that. I um I think that I try to make sure that what I am writing is authentic, right? And so if that means I have to delve into some tough topics, um, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to do that in service of the story so that the story rings true, that, I've committed when I sit down to write a book, I've committed to write something that is authentic and real, unless I happen to decide to write sci-fi or something one day. But, so that's my commitment that I make to the reader. And I feel like I have to, be obligated to that and to see it through. And so if that means it takes me into some pretty dark themes, I'm willing to go there. Like I said, in service of the story. One of these days, I always tell my agent, one of these days, I'm going to write like a happy little rom com. I really am.
Yeah.
And she says, that's fine. You'll have to get a pseudonym or something. But I really am, because sometimes I think, oh gosh, am I going too dark? And especially with the book I'm working on now, and I'm like, oh yeah, like, but again, it deals with the topic that we all have or know or have tangentially been involved in, and I think it's an important issue. So
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a long, rambling way of saying, Liz, Greg, I have not a clue, but it works.
Oh, it absolutely works. I would also say, um, you write. There's something that I really love. You write with this real spirit of generosity. I think in your most recent book, even when you kind of break down the characters, and I don't want to say too much because I don't want to give away anything story or plot wise, but there's a real generosity with a lot of your main characters in terms of this. What I guess what I could say is like an unconventional family structure, with various generations of
Mhm.
characters like that, and that really butts up against a real ruthless kind of selfishness with a couple of the other characters that we come to kind of find out about. And I think that that spirit of generosity as a reader really helps to kind of balance it out in terms of your writing. I think that it can be said for all of your books. There's that family kind of togetherness and generosity that helps to kind of buoy it a little, some of the heavier stuff a little bit more. It's just it's a great balance tonally. I think that you are able to strike.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you. I
Yeah, and
do try to infuse my books with some of that. I always try to make sure that my book has a little humor and maybe a little romance.
Oh yeah.
I can't write romance. I admire romance writers because that's tough. Like I do a kissing scene. Okay, so this is a true story. Okay, I'm gonna go off on a tangent. So with my first book, you know, Elise Littlejohn has this guy who's kind of like flirting with her, but I was really kind of scared to explore that because I feel like with romance, if you don't do it well, it comes off kind of like hokey, right? And so it's like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. Like she gives him a peck on the cheek or something. And I'm like, okay, good. So I got in and out of there. And then the second book, I actually had a woman who was like in the bed with the guy. And I'm telling you,
Mhm.
that was the scene that made me the most nervous. I was like, "Oh my gosh, what do
Yeah.
I do here?" Now, I'm not a
Yeah.
prude. I got 3 kids, right? But I was still like, "Ugh." So I put them in there, hugged and kissed a little bit, and then I faded to black and I got the heck out of there.
Yeah.
With my 3rd book, I was like, "Oh my gosh, she's gotta do something here." And, so I wrote this, I don't wanna spoil it for anybody, so I wrote this scene in there. My my husband, when he wrote it, goes, "Wow." It's like, "What?" And I was like, "I know, right? Did I do that?" So,
Yeah.
it's not erotica, y'all, so don't get all excited, don't go rushing out to buy the book if you're thinking it's, like, erotica, it's not. But for me,
Right.
that's what it feels
Yeah.
like. I was like, "Whoa, okay." But, I'm
yes.
always scared because, like I said, again, it goes to my point of how I want my books to feel authentic, and I don't want them to kinda slide off into caricature or, kinda that hokey thing, and so I think that's why, maybe that's what I'm gonna have to do. I'm gonna have to look at, you know, getting my chops together to write a real serious romance scene or something. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Now you've given
Well,
me my marching orders.
and what is it? Fantasy erotica is so big right now, like
Romantic.
dragon love scenes. I mean, I can
Oh
barely
my,
get human love scenes down. So
I
I'm with
know.
you.
I can't get 2 Homo sapiens to do that stuff. I certainly could.
Well, I have to say, in our most recent book, Greg wrote one love scene, and I was very impressed with how he handled it because I just can't write them without picturing a member of my family or someone I worked with reading them. So, I mean, I need to get
Right.
over that. But I
Right.
think it's a very specific skill.
Yeah.
But I did want to go back to the humor because you said you like to, imbue humor into your work, and you definitely have that. I mean, there are laugh out loud lines, especially in your most recent book. Just real a lot of sass, which I love. So I think you do a great job of balancing the darker elements with levity, which is, I think critical
Yeah.
to delve into anything about murder or betrayal or as we wanted to get to, you have some great imposter characters. So let's dig into those a little bit without spoiling anything. But what is it about characters with two sides or more sides that you like to write?
Mm.
You know what? Here's the thing. I think that with imposters, there's like a spectrum, right? So you have the imposter who is like kind of the con artist. And so they put on a facade and they've got some malicious intent or something. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have like ordinary people, dare I say myself, who's like, oh yeah, I wrote a book, I'm a writer. But deep down,
Mhm.
I'm like, "What? I wrote a book. I'm a writer. And so that
Yeah.
kind of feeling like, oh gosh, I think I pulled the wool over everybody's eyes, right? And so I think that there are these ends of the spectrum. And so I try to have characters that kind of are somewhere in there, and sometimes they're way on the end. Um,
Mhm.
so, for example, in All Her Little Secrets, my first book, like Elise Littlejohn was like the queen of imposters, right? She had this whole other side of herself that, and she had it for a long time too. Like she didn't just wake up and decide that. But again, it wasn't anything that was necessarily malicious. Like her imposter was there out of necessity. She felt like if people really knew who she really was, because she was self aware enough to know I've got some dark side. But if people knew that, I could be in really big trouble. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, Dina Wood from What You Leave Behind, my latest book, who she just thinks I've got everybody fooled. Nobody knows that I am a broken mess because in the book she is grieving the loss of her mother.
Right.
And, she's just come through a really ugly divorce and she's just been fired. And so she goes through town and she's like, oh, yeah, I'm fine. Oh, yeah, everything's okay. And here's the thing with imposters, eventually they either have to fess up to themselves or they have to fess up to other people, right?
Right.
Because you
Mhm.
can't keep that up for that long. And so I like to tap into that aspect of my characters where they are trying to figure out, okay, who am I fooling? Am I fooling myself or am I fooling other people?
Mhm.
And so, for example, I think early on in the book, Dina realizes everybody keeps asking me, "Am I okay?" And then she starts to look out at the world and she sees how other people are handling loss and grief, and how she comes to realize there's really this undercurrent of love that keeps people buoyed up in these really bad moments. And so she's like, ah, okay, yeah, I've really kind of been fooling myself, right? Because I'm not okay, and I'm not going to be okay until I really kind of come to grips with that. And you kind of get the same thing with Elise Littlejohn as well when she finally realizes, you know what, everybody could know my secret. To hell with
Mhm.
it, because I can't live like this anymore. And so I think exploring that, not only as a character's kind of, arc over the course of the book, but just the psychology and kind of understanding the psychology of how people, live with themselves and live with other people, to me is like the best part in a book, right? Is kind of figuring out who is this character and who does that character believe that they are, whether it's
Right.
to
Mm.
themselves or to the world. Does that make sense?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, that
Another.
makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
And with Dina in particular, when you were just talking about, go ahead,
No, no, continue, please.
you go.
Okay, I was going to say, going back to Elise in the first book, I think there's another layer of imposter, which is interesting. There's also sort of an imposter aspect that's thrust upon her because she's a Black woman working in a corporate in law in sort of a high powered position. So not only is she dealing with her internal stuff, she's also dealing with the external stuff being thrust upon her. And I imagine writing
Right.
that sort of extra aspect of the imposter has to be interesting from a writing perspective as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even get into that level of imposter that she is, where she's just in, a work situation where she's kind
Right.
of thrust into the situation. Where here's the thing about that, she knows she's competent enough to do that job, but everybody else around her is trying to make her believe that she cannot. And
Mhm.
so that takes it kind is kind of the flip side of the imposter, right? And it's only when she's like, I think she's like at the office one day and she's kind of thinking to herself, like, my God, what, I don't know anything about budgets and all this other stuff she's supposed to be doing. But then she later realizes, wait a minute, I'm smart. I could do this. And so that's the other part about imposter syndrome is how do you get on the outside of it, right? Is that, it was like me when I was sitting in that workshop and I
Mm,
chose that particular section to read at the workshop because I thought, oh yeah, this is some of my best writing. But then when I looked up and everybody is looking at me like, "Oh my god, what the heck is she what kind of?" Because they're writing literary stuff, and I'm sitting in there describing a bullet hole in the side of a man's head, and it took me a day or two, but then I realized, oh yeah, hell, this is just as good as some of that stuff that I just read about purple flowers on the side of a field. So, you know, that's kind of my take on imposters.
yeah, I love that.
Well,
Oops.
I wanted to go back a little bit when you were talking about Dina and her going through grief and basically she turns outward. She gets involved in someone else's business, in what I perceived partially as an effort to take the kind of any self-awareness or attention off her own pain. And I
Mhm.
loved that you kind of made her this like nosy character who then ends up being, a detective, a fighter for justice. She is so many things ultimately. And then I think those things that she comes to find out about other people inform her own journey.
Mhm.
But I love how, again, you're kind of doing this hat trick where you almost think it's about one thing in the beginning of the book, and then it's something much larger. and and I don't know if this is a corollary or not, but with your work in law, and I'm imagining some of the different characters and scenarios you've encountered, were there any of those real life experiences that contributed to these complex characters?
You know what? I never thought of it in that regard until you just said it. I think that a lot of the things that I did as a lawyer, I was able to translate into the craft and into writing my books. And by that I mean, for example, being persuasive in writing. Because when I was a lawyer, I had to be persuasive of sorts. If I were, writing a brief, I was trying to persuade a judge to decide a case a particular way. Or if I were writing a memo
Mhm.
to a group of, corporate executives, I wanted them to evaluate both sides of an issue and kind of come down however, they felt it was necessary to come down. And so I think I like how you describe it as a hat trick. I think it is a matter of kind of melding, character attributes along with plot and setting to kind of build this kind of whirlwind that the reader gets caught up in. The highest compliment I get is when people say, I could not stand so and so in your book. And I'm like, ah, gotcha. Right.
Ah,
Because I've created, something where people have an emotion around a character, a fictional character. This person is not even real, but you felt so strongly about that, that maybe I've done my job. Right.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that really answers your question, but I really do kind of take the craft of putting a story together very seriously because I know how I like to feel when I read books. I remember
Mhm.
reading Blacktop Wasteland by Sean Cosby.
sure.
And that opening
Great.
scene, right, there's
Yeah.
an opening scene. I could smell. the oil from the car, and right? And I
Yeah.
was like, I read that and I was like, "Oh, yeah, this is how you do it. This is how you do it," because I felt a certain way when I read that passage. And so that's what I want to bring to my stories is, you know, that not only are you all caught up in the characters, but I hope like in what you leave behind, you feel like you smell sea salt from the ocean coming up,
Mhm.
and
Mm.
you smell the fish and grits that Dina sits down at Mrs. Trainer's house to eat. um but I'm not saying that you have to be a lawyer to do that, though, but I think you do have to take the craft very seriously, and you have to be committed to what does it take to build a character? What does it take to put a reader into a certain scene and, give them this feeling like they are right there? Um,
Mm.
I did a book club once for a library of, the library had a section of books for the blind,
Hmm.
and they
Okay.
asked if I would come and speak to the book club. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, sure." But that was the best experience, not only because I got to talk to a different segment of readers, but because they reminded me why it's so important to learn the craft of writing, right? Because a couple of the people were like, "Oh, you really put a lot of detail into this particular scene." And so I felt like it, because I can't see, so I need to know, what that scene looks like or what that room looks like. And I thought, "Oh, wow. Yeah. So I need to spend some time doing that because my readers aren't like you and I. I have readers who can't even see, but I still want them to enjoy the books as well." I've kind of gone
Mhm.
off on a tangent there, but that I think it speaks to the craft. And I was fortunate that I took some things from my prior job and I was able to translate
Mm.
them into this new career.
Yeah. Well, that
I
brings
love
up.
that tangent, especially because one of the things that I think is so remarkable about all of your books, but your most recent one in particular, is the place as a character.
Mhm,
Brunswick, Georgia, a place I've never been to, but now I feel like I have.
mhm,
You clearly, have a lot of personal experience, feelings, love, observational kind of relationship to Georgia, to
mhm,
this area, whether that is made up or experienced, it doesn't matter because it feels so authentic. And, I think Sean is a great comparison because I experienced that when I read his books as well, that like the setting is as important to the story
mhm.
as the characters. Do you want to talk a little bit about, Georgia and the South and Mississippi, as your settings and why they're.
Yeah. So I always feel exactly like that. Like setting should be a character as well as the people who walk and talk in the books. Um, in my second book, Anywhere You Run, that book was historical and took place in 1964 Mississippi. Um, and I was not born or raised in Mississippi, so of course I had to do a lot of research. And so for me, I always think when I'm writing about a place, what are the things that make me feel like I am in that place? Like, right now I'm sitting here in a little room that's off my living room, and this is where I write. Excuse me, what makes me feel like I am in, a writing, room, for example, my lamp, my computer, what are all those things? And so for me, when I am writing a book, I'm trying to think of gathering all those things. Of course, all my books are set in the South. And so that means I need to look at specific details. I can't just say, yeah, it's a southern city, because every city is different. And what you leave behind, the book takes place in Low Country, Georgia, which is along the Atlantic coast of Georgia. Uh, if you ever get a chance to go, it's just beautiful, beautiful area. My husband and I started going down there for vacation before we even had kids, and it's just spectacularly gorgeous. And so I wanted to make sure that I captured those details because I think that is uniquely, Southern Coast to be. The Southern Coast is very different from the Maine Coast. No disrespect, I love them both. It's just that they're just different types of coast, and you can feel it. There's a vibe when you're on the Maine coast. There's a different vibe when you're on the Georgia coast. And so
Mhm.
for me, as I'm trying to write, I want to make sure that I pick up little details, you know, the grasses that are blowing off the sand dunes on the Atlantic coast, and those things that actually, even if you haven't been to the Georgia coast, you think, oh, okay. I think I know what tall grass is on a sand. I think I know what a beach looks like. Oh, is that what it smells like? You can actually smell the salt from the water coming up. And so I want to make sure that I have those little touch points because those are the things that bring the reader in, I think. And that's what creates the setting. Again, like I said, I think, writing about the South and living in the South makes it a little easier. Yeah, I can, kind of go and see. But I also think that it's the people in this part of the country that are also part of that setting, right? I have, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he preached in, where Dr. King preached in, is about 15 minutes from my house. Um, that's part of the setting, but then that's also where a lot of civil rights, meetings and movement occurred too. And so I want to make sure that that's infused in the book. And so not only am I taking a structure, but I'm also trying to create a vibe within
Mm,
the setting, if that makes any sense.
for sure.
I love that. Yeah. Greg, you had like two questions and I just rolled right over you, so I'm going to shut up.
Oh, not at all. No, no, no. I think we actually, it's funny after you mentioned how I was the most stable connection. Of course, now I'm cut out and I had to jump on a hotspot earlier. So I'm kind of like trying to cobble this thing together and I feel like I'm lagging a lot. So
I jinxed
apologies to both. This is kind of going back a little bit, but I was going to ask Wanda, I'm sort of interested because, you're talking about the sort of the sensory, very lush kind of detail oriented writing. And I have to imagine coming from a corporate law background, most of the writing you're doing is very kind of dry and precise and technical. And so I wonder how much of a, kind of a, that what that learning experience was like to sort of like get yourself into this more kind of very sensory oriented type of prose style from that.
Oh my gosh, that is the $65,000 question, right? I remember like my early drafts of my first book read like an appellate brief. So it's like I remember sending them out to an agent and she gave me a gift though, really. She did. She rejected the book, obviously, but she gave me a gift because she's like, I feel like I am just standing in the middle of nowhere in this book. You're telling me all these things that are happening, but I don't know where I am. I don't know what it feels like or what it looks like in this place. I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. Because when you write as a lawyer, you're given a specific set of facts, right? You're given these facts. The plaintiff did this, they did that, this happened, that happened, and you take those facts and then you have to write them in a way that they're persuasive, but you never, describe the room where the two men entered and shot the gun that killed, you know the young man, and so this is why the two criminals are on trial. You don't do that. And so I had to learn how to do that, and that for me was really, really hard. I think that that's probably the hardest part that I had in transitioning from law into creative writing, because I was like, boom, 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 boom. Here is what happened. She walked into the office. She saw her boss dead. She didn't scream. She didn't call the police. She left. And I'm like, that's what the opening scene was like when I first wrote All Her Little Secrets. It's like, that's not creative writing, right? And so, of course, all that worked itself out. I took courses and did workshops and things like that. Um, but I think every writer kind of goes through that, right? Because, I mean, people are born with innate talent, but you still have to learn how to write a scene. You have to learn how to have a beginning and a middle and an end, and you have to learn how to put characters into a scene and have them exit, and then you have to do all these things. So I think everybody kind of learns that. For me, it was particularly difficult because, remember, I wasn't talking to people. I wasn't talking to other writers and saying, hey, how do you open up a scene like this? I was just writing by myself in secret and not telling anyone. And so I was trying to figure that out. You know what? Maybe I might have been published 10 years ago if I had just shared this with somebody, right? Yeah, I had to
Right.
learn all this stuff. Um, but you know what? That was
Well,
part of the journey too. That was part of the journey of writing, which was getting me to another place where, I felt like, oh, the light bulb goes off. Yeah.
mhm,
Mm,
yeah,
mm.
no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, in your case, it's almost like the degree of difficulty is a little more so because there's that whole mantra in creative writing of show don't tell, and it's almost like you had to unlearn writing super literal stuff in order to then do everything really in a sensory way. So it's almost like it kind of like ups the ante in that way for you as well.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things I wanted to say, this is actually less of a question, but more of something I just wanted to express to you about this your most recent book. You write really beautifully about grief and loss and mourning in it. And I was very touched. As Liz knows, I lost my father several years ago and went through the loss of a parent, which Dina does in this book. And I just wanted to say thank you for that because it was really a pretty beautiful kind of, I don't know, reflection on that process.
Mm.
Thank you. Yeah,
I
I
think writing
you know what?
about loss.
No,
Go
go
ahead.
go on. Go, Liz.
I was just gonna say I think writing loss the way you have is as challenging, if not more, than writing an effective love scene. So
Oh,
what
really?
you may feel lacking in one area, you've really mastered in the other. But
Indeed.
please go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, well, thank you for that. I was just going to say, I lost my mom. I lost my mom when I was younger than Dina in the book. Dina's 39. And so I was unmoored when I lost my mother. I really was. I was lost. And I always said I would never write about that experience because it was just too painful and it was too raw. And so I knew that, going into this book, I needed to have Dina in a place where she felt most broken. And I
Yeah.
debated for a long time whether I was going to deal with grief, because to me, that is where you are most broken, when you lose someone you love dearly. Um, but I was afraid to, because I know those feelings and I know how really raw they can still be. Like, I could, some days I'm fine. Some days I can wake up and it still feels like the loss is just brand new. Um, but I finally, again, I know I've said it at least 4 times in this conversation. I want my books to be authentic.
Yeah.
And so if I were going to write about it, I had to write about it authentically. And so I chose to go down that path. It was hard though. There's a scene in that book that every time I read it, it makes me cry. I will never read
Mm.
that scene in public. So
Mm.
yeah.
Wow, that's I think leaving off with writing authentically, even if it scares you, is a wonderful message for our writer listeners out there. So thank you so much, Wanda, for all of your time, for your beautiful answers, thoughtful answers. And we'd love to connect people who aren't in contact with you on social media. Can you let us know where they can find you and what books of yours? I guess all of your books are available everywhere.
Yes,
So
wherever you buy your books. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. I'm Wanda Morris Writes. On Twitter, I'm Wanda Mo14. On Facebook, I'm Wanda Morris Writer. And you can always reach me through my website, WandaMorris.com. So please feel free to reach out.
thank you again. Thank you so much.
This was fun. Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thank you, Wanda. We really appreciate your time, and it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.